Welcome to the EarthWorks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Simmons, and I am very happy to say that on this week's version of the EarthWorks podcast, we have our old friend, Mr. Lawrence Mayhew, back. And Lawrence, I think I've probably shared this with you, and I don't want to feed your head, but you are one of the most popular podcasts that we have. So I am forced to bring you back on to talk about whatever we can talk about here as we move into the end of the season. And there's a lot of stuff that we can always talk about. You and I have been talking a lot about chemistry, and for those of you who may not have seen other Lawrence podcasts, first of all and foremost, I'm going to strongly encourage you to go back. We just replayed. I don't know if you know this, Lawrence, but we just replayed the one that you and I did. I think Jack might have been with us, but you and I did it on humic acids. And Lawrence is a world-renowned, I think that's fair to say, humic acid specialist and expert, and he's been very important to us here at EarthWorks in helping us with our chemistry and making sure everything is stable. And Lawrence, one of the things that we've gone through this year, and you and I have worked pretty closely on, is making sure that these Foliar Plus products that we're putting out there, these liquid products that Mr. Brunetti, our dear friend and my mentor, helped us develop, which are very, very complex. We've used the humic acids as a backbone, but it's not easy to keep things stable chemically in this industry. And I think as a result of that, a lot of products that we see in the market and a lot of products that the folks listening to that might be using are fairly linear. And the material that you and I are building together, there's nothing linear about that at all, is there? I mean, no. These things are big and ugly and hairy. And I think I counted the other day when looking at the plant, 32 raw materials in a couple of these liquids. Talk to me about the chemistry, the dynamic chemistry of maintaining that within a jug. And then one of the things I want to go through is one of the things that's very vogue again, and I think this has a lot to do with labor, but one of the things that's really become vogue, and in my career it's kind of cycled, but tank mixing is back to doing very large witches brews. I mean, we've got guys out there that are putting 10, 20 different chemicals into a 200-gallon or 250-gallon tank, and hoping that it all works out well. Let's talk about the chemistry of that kind of a tank mix. And we can talk about the chemistry of what we're going through to keep our things stabilized. But what's the best strategy? I mean, again, we may not change anybody's mind in terms of, putting less into the tank, because this is, in fact, a labor issue. It is a time issue. It's, it's a matter of, we don't have a lot of people. We got to get a lot of stuff out. What's the risk that anybody is taking by doing what I call these witches brews?
Precipitation. In other words, something in there has a high probability of reacting with something else from somebody else's product, and they will combine, they will release energy, then they need to stabilize. And that stabilization may be unnoticed a lot of times.
Right.
But this is the reason why people like us, manufacturers, always encourage somebody to do a little pre-mix, a little bucket chemistry first, if you will,
a bench
jar chemistry, bench testing, because heaven knows what you're actually putting together in these, what you already mentioned, are what I call witches brews.
Yeah.
The most likely thing to happen is that they will produce something that will plug up their nozzles, it'll plug up their filters, because there will be a reaction, and the chemists call that precipitation. That's just one way of these complex solutions trying to settle down, trying to strive for equilibrium, trying to seek their own balance. Now, I suspect that what really happens in reality is they get away with it. They mix
sometimes
up, they
most
mix
of
up
the time,
that
probably.
Mix up that brew and get it out there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you beat the brew? Can you put this stuff together and then quickly run it out onto the property and get it out before the chemical reactions start to happen? I mean, is that sometimes what's happening?
it must be reality because I'm so shocked when I see
Yeah.
some of these combinations. I developed a Excel spreadsheet database type thing that allows me to plug in various concentrations. If I know what the concentrations are in the original product, and then I throw all these products into a brew, and then I read, then my little readout tells me what you really have. It's really surprising how they could achieve the same thing with one simple chemical, because something's going to express itself out of all this milieu. And that expression is called ion activity, how the ions actually express themselves, which is what you're measuring when you measure pH, by the way. But if you put you put different chemicals together, some of those chemicals go through what can be called ion activity. In other words, how will they express themselves, and how will they work out in the field? How will they impact the plant? And I'm really surprised at the complexity of these witches brews, but yet the simplicity of the overall concoction that they end up with. You could use ammonium sulfate, for example, instead of throwing all that stuff together. I did that once. I asked for, give me this guy's witches brew. I want to see what my program tells me. My program said, you can achieve the same thing by using ammonium sulfate, because that's what's being expressed ionically. Ammonium and sulfate go right to the top of the chart on that one brew. So
what do you mean by being expressed? Explain that so we understand that better.
let's use pH as an example. Sometimes you stand up in front of some fancy scientist and they say, pH is the negative logarithm of the hydrogen ion concentration. Yeah, great.
Blah, blah, blah.
But that's not how you measure it in a lab. That's not it at all. The lab will take a sample of the material in question, and then they'll put a probe into, let's say they pour it into a beaker, and then they put the probe into this solution. And the probes are actually measuring the hydrogen ion activity. In other words, some of these ions make it to the probe, and then they register a number. There's a machine that'll calculate what that concentration of hydrogen ions are that are actively being expressed in that solution. And we call it pH, which is an operational definition. The operational definition of pH is what you did to get that number. What you did was you put some probes in it and you read the meter.
You've been big on the operational definitions, and it's been fascinating. I mean, I've just referred to pH as the percentage or power of hydrogen. I mean, I know that's pretty layman, but and pretty lame of me, but and I've gotten criticized by the powers to be and on that. But I mean, it's kind of what we're looking at when we're looking at the simplicity of this. No,
imagine a room full of people. You take a photograph of it, and then maybe there's 1,000 people in that room. Okay. Every once in a while, you see someone with a red shirt on. Every once in a great while. Let's say those are hydrogen ions.
Right.
And they're in the minority, which is the way it really is in reality.
Because nobody wears red shirts anymore.
Well, there's the odd one here and there.
Right, exactly.
And then one of these little red dots, let's call them hydrogen ions, decides they have to go to the bathroom. Well, they're going to be bumping through all these other dots, right? All these yellows and greens and blues and purples. They're bouncing around. Finally, they make it to the bathroom. Let's say that was their way of expressing themselves. Okay.
I see.
That hydrogen ion activity expresses itself only by fighting its way through a whole bunch of other steric interferences. So, and then you put a probe in that solution, and the probe says, oh, you have a pH of such and such. But that's not true hydrogen concentration. That's not the negative logarithm of hydrogen ions. That's theoretical. That's in pure water. You add anything to that water and that all goes away. Now the hydrogen ions need to be expressing themselves as activity. Same thing applies to calcium, magnesium, sulfur, so forth.
Potassium.
Their activity can be measured.
Yeah.
Because they're competing with everything else in that solution.
One of the things we talk a lot about in doing these tank mixes is alkaline hydrolysis, which is the process by which these things are reacting. So we typically say start with a tank, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been saying this for long enough, so I hope you don't. But alkaline hydrolysis is, if we start with a tank of water and then buffer the pH down into a 5.560 range, and then start adding our other chemistries, what's happening there chemically? What is the purpose of buffering the water to avoid alkaline hydrolysis?
First of all, what are you using to lower the pH?
It could be anything. It could be phosphoric acid, quite honestly. Does it matter what we use?
Yes.
I mean, there are commercially,
yes.
And this is unscripted because you and I have never had this conversation, so hopefully we're going down the right road. But there are commercially a whole host of products that you could buy that would be called, buffering agents, simple buffering agents, some of which actually can change the color of the water so when the pH is getting down to that 6.0 range. But there's, but you're right. I mean, there could be a million things. I mean, even within the buffering agents, I know they're made of different materials, different chemistry. So I don't know what's the best way to explain this whole process of buffering the tank prior to putting anything in to avoid alkaline hydrolysis. Is there a good answer?
So the goal is to make it more acid.
Right.
Right. The alkaline hydrolysis will result in precipitation. Usually you see various clays and micas falling out of solution. And I came up with a concoction one time where even the lab couldn't identify it, working with
shocking. That shocks me.
Yeah, with our products. I said, well, how many items are there in your library? He goes, 800,000, and I can't find out what yours is. So
800,001.
800. Yeah, now we can add another. The weird thing about these complex concoctions is that it's hard to predict what exactly you're creating there. So let's say, I'm going to guess they use phosphoric acid. You already brought that up. So what if phosphoric acid is having a negative effect on what you want to achieve with plant growth? Maybe there's plenty of phosphorus out there already. What do you do then? Well, then you pick something else. Pick hydrogen chloride, which is an acid. And then you put that in, hydrochloric acid, and you end up with way too much chlorine in your
killing
solution.
all your microbes.
Okay. So let's go with another one. Let's try sulfuric acid. Then you end up with way too much sulfur. Now you're probably over applying sulfur. I don't think people realize that's the case. These additives have a great deal of chemical activity, and sulfates, chlorides, phosphates are extremely active materials. So you're actually making something in the jug. You're actually making something in the tank that originally wasn't even there. Oh yeah, it impacts the pH all right, but now chemically you have a brand new solution. You don't have what you bought. You just created your own solution. Heaven knows what you're making. It's really hard to say.
You're in your own little chemistry lab there.
So that became an issue with EarthWorks products where you were having trouble. If you're having trouble with it being incompatible with other tank mixes, or just having trouble with this stuff making it through the winter and still being in good shape in the springtime, shelf life. So I actually hired a consultant to consult me on this because I was having a real struggle with what exactly can I look for and what exactly should we do.
Wait, you're my consultant to consult me on this. So you're consulting somebody to consult you on, so you can consult
afraid
me.
So.
I can consult a client down the road. It's an interesting thing how this works.
And it had everything to do with this ion activity expression that I was just talking about.
Right.
So I needed somebody with some knowledge of if you put this in, put that in, put this in, what is going to be the ion activity and what is going to be what they call a saturation index resulting from that. Saturation index simply means if you have too much of these things going on, they will precipitate out of solution. They will clog nozzles. They will clog screens. Yeah. They won't make it through the winter, or they won't even make it out the door in extreme cases. Well, we had conditions. We had take a product, for example, that we were having trouble with. So I hired this fellow. And it was an experience. It was new knowledge for me, and really worked great. The product looks great now, by the
Yes,
way.
it does. And it's
But
been working quite well since July, if you're talking about CalVantage.
yeah, he sent me a spreadsheet with, I'm going to say 90 possible precipitations that could occur.
So
And
you're
he,
looking at precipitations. You're looking at what can react in the jug in this case, and then
yes,
create a crystal that would
yes.
settle to the bottom. And again, going back to the concept of tank mixing, those little crystallizations, which can happen in any one of these witches brews,
Mhm.
would create enough of a plugging effect that, especially on on our kind of spray rigs in the turf and ornamental industry, they'll clog those up pretty quickly.
Well, what he sent me a spreadsheet of about 90 reaction results. He told me that if anything was highlighted in yellow, that it meant that there was strong potential for reaction, i.e. in this case, a precipitate, and the whole sheet was yellow. I think there was just the odd blank spot once in a while.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Everything?
everything. So now I knew we had a challenge. And what I learned from him was that we can balance. Sulfates seem to be particularly bad, and chlorides are particularly bad at causing these reactions.
Why those two particularly?
They're very, very reactive molecules. They're extremely reactive.
So if
They're
you're
very
using
unstable.
and I don't want to take you off track, but if we're using a sulfuric acid or a
Sulfate.
calcium sulfate or anything with sulfur in it, does that create a potential reaction in
Yes.
a tank?
In
So
the
we want to be
experience,
careful with the sulfates, and the same thing would be true of the chlorides. Go ahead.
yeah, what I learned from my
going.
advisor, those were the big ones.
Yeah.
And so we concentrated on reducing or eliminating sulfates, which is not easy. You'd think, oh, just get rid of them. But we have so many ingredients that they're there. They're in something. So then it became a challenge. We try to eliminate chlorides, which is not possible. You can reduce them. You can get them way, way, way down, but you can't entirely get rid of them.
Now let's talk
Especially,
about chlorides real quick. I mean, my
yeah.
concern as a soil biologist is the chloride having an impact on soil biology. I mean, and you've heard me say this a million times. I mean, I'm not a big fan of heavy chlorinated materials because they have the potential to create a very negative impact on biological activity within the soil. Now, having said that, plant does need some level of chloride. I mean, these are elements that the plant still needs. We just want to be careful not to over apply, and we want to make sure that we're creating buffers. And I'll come back to this concept of buffers here in a second. But is there chlorides? Talk to me about chlorides. I mean, you know my take on this, but again, I'm majorly biased on the biological side. But how about
chlorides are actually necessary for plant life and microbial life. You can actually
our life.
Yeah, you can put you can put a chloride guarantee on your label if you want to. For example.
Thank you.
I think so, but it's
Oregon wouldn't like me for that.
My point is, it's just so well recognized that you can actually do that too. You're absolutely right about a balance, and I became really, really curious about how much. I used to just measure chlorides as parts per million. And then you'd say, oh, that's too much.
Yes, I would, wouldn't I?
Yeah. And I'm thinking, well, what's too much and what's not enough?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm asking. What's too much?
Well, then I started plugging in what I called an eco-adaptive approach to this. In other words, in nature, there's a certain amount of chlorine in nature that's very acceptable. However, all by itself means nothing. Yeah. But what would be the ratio of calcium to chlorine, for example, in nature? And then I looked at that and I go, oh, there's not too much there, because relative to magnesium and calcium and potassium, my data says you're okay at certain levels, certain ratios. Looking at the ratio is so much more important than just the absolute number. Chlorine's a great example of that. In the past, what we thought was way too much turns out to be okay. It's well within the parameters that I was looking at on this eco-adaptive.
But you're talking about it from a chemical reactivity standpoint, or are you talking? Are you also including the biological?
No, you cannot take that narrow-minded approach and get away with it.
Yes, I can.
In agrodynamics.
That's what I do for a living.
In agriculture And in growing plants in general, growing turf, it doesn't matter what it is.
Yeah.
You really have to look at the balance of these
Right.
materials, which is so much more important than the absolute number.
So if we had a level of chlorine, as long as we have other things
Yes.
around it to keep
Right.
it balanced, it's when chlorine is out there all by its lonesome and really the predominant element or a predominant element, if you will. That's when we get into trouble with
Right.
chlorine. Now, what is the impact chlorine has in tank mixing? I mean, if we have a lot of chlorine in a particular product that we're throwing into this witch's brew, is that potentially going to create reactions that could create crystallizations?
Right. Right. So my approach lately on product development and research has been to try to get the chlorine levels down as low as possible, but yet it's balanced with other things, but as low as possible, because we can't risk that reaction with another product.
Right.
These are highly reactive materials.
And this is funny because as a manufacturer, we're thrown into a tank with everybody else. Our products tend to be very colorful in the sense that they're very dark. So when the crystallizations occur from these tank mixes, it looks like it's us, and it's often not us because you got 20 other things in somebody's spray tank. What's the strategy here? I mean, what's the way? How do we help people understand that the chemistry of these tanks are pretty reactive? I mean, you got pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, it could be fungicides, it could be anything in these tanks. I mean, growth regulators, we don't even know a whole lot about what growth regulators are doing chemically. And then on top of all this, we have carriers within these products that aren't even on a label. So we don't even know what the carrier's composition is. So these witches brews are just really massive from a chemical standpoint. They're just incredible little, pods of reactivity, if you will. Pods of reactivity. I have to write that down. I like that.
Pods of reactivity. Miniature atom bombs.
Yes, exactly. It's kind of what we're creating in our own little world. It's funny because some of the, I've talked to superintendents that have put together mixes, sometimes with us and sometimes not with us. And, they literally get such a reaction that the whole thing just gels up to the point where they literally have to get inside the tank with a shovel and scoop the gel out or the mess. I mean, I remember when we first started making MagVantage, and I think I've shared with you this story, when we first started making MagVantage back in the day when Jerry was still with us, our first runs were so reactive that a 5-gallon bucket was, as it weighed 100 pounds, and I literally could have used it as a foundation to build put posts on to put a deck on it. I mean, it was concrete. It was truly just completely reacted out. I mean, it was amazing to me to see that level of chemical reaction within what we thought was going to be a pretty stabilized, fertility product. But that's the nature of chemistry in this, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting that you picked on magnesium because that is a very, very difficult element to work with.
As we've realized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm working with it right now in the lab. I'm going to go down there after we're done and see what the beaker looks like.
What happened an hour ago?
Nothing.
See if we smell a fire coming in behind you or smoke or something like that.
Yeah, heaven knows in these concoctions, you could produce a toxic gas. I mean, it's quite possible. Just using household chlorine bleach and other chemicals have killed people.
Well, it's the old Mentos and Coca-Cola reaction, right?
Yeah, so this is something that happens every day.
Yeah.
So when you were asking me, well, how do you approach this from a product development standpoint? Approaching it by trying to keep these ion activities down as low as possible within the product, and wondering what else they can react with out there that we don't even know what's going to go into this concoction. Hopefully, reducing the chances that they're going to react with something else. So that's been my approach. We don't have any control over it once somebody starts pouring things together.
Right.
We do our absolute best to stabilize our products. We do our absolute best to try not to produce something that may react with something else. And if you see a gel, in my experience, almost without exception, it's silicon.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Creating some issues. Yeah. I mean, there's gels and there's non-gels, but there can be all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. So you talked about doing a bench test or a tank test or a jar test, I guess you said.
Sure.
What's the best way to do this? And what's the procedure? So if I want to put together a witch's brew with whatever these 10 materials are, 50 materials, I mean, go walk me through the procedure for the average guy who is not a chemist. How do we test this? I mean, and every tank could be a little bit different, but how do we do a jar test?
Okay, how many do they typically mix? 3, 4, 5?
More than that, usually.
Let's say 5. That's a lot in itself. Let's label them A, B, C, D, E. Okay. Today, you blend them in that order, A followed by B, and so forth. So on, A, B, C, D, E.
You put them into the tank in that order. Is that what you're saying?
In that order.
Yeah.
Right.
So you fill it up with water, and you put A in first, you put B in second.
And nothing happens. So you say, great, fine. Then you go spray it. Now, the next day, you don't remember the order. So the order gets mixed up. All of a sudden, you might have a reaction because that order is critical. But not knowing what we're working with, I can't tell you what order to put them in.
Right.
Yeah. And
but if we're literally taking a jar or a bucket, filling it up halfway with water, putting in product A, and then product B, and then product C. And so the process is that we're observing what reaction might be in the water with product A first, and then we throw product B in second, see if there's a reaction. Do we wait any period of time before we go and put in product C? Can we do them fairly quickly, one after another? I'm just talking about the procedure of doing a bench trial in a bucket.
So if you do A, B, and C, and then you go to lunch, and then you do D, you just created a variable. You just created another unknown.
Yes.
By doing that.
But if we get a bucket, fill it up with water, we put in A, then B, then C, then D, then E, and go to lunch and come back, and it looks like it's stable and there isn't a participant. Should we screen this from that bucket and see if there is crystallization going on?
Yes.
Okay, so that's that. So the simple answer to doing a jar test or a bench trial is put in a sequence. Write it down so you're putting it in always in the same way, and then observing it in the bucket for how much time?
Well, we said go to lunch. I don't know if that's
for
realistic
lunch,
or not.
for an hour.
Reality might
I guess the question is, will it react immediately? Will it react over a period of time?
That's called the kinetics of the reaction. That's unpredictable based upon what we know, what we don't know. That's the kinetics of the reaction. Temperature will impact it. Time will impact it. Some things will react first before others. That's why the order is critical.
Yeah.
That we address that in our production methods. We have a specific order. It's a recipe in which we follow that order. We vary from that order. We're taking chances that we're going to come up with a different situation chemistry wise, and we might get a reaction, or we do get a reaction and we change the order. So hit and miss says change the order. Yeah.
That's why we all hated chemistry in high school, because it never understood the bloody thing.
Yeah, reaction kinetics. That's what you're talking about.
All right. One of the things you've always taught us was that with the humic and fulvics that we use in our products, putting our products in the tank first will help that buffering process.
Yes.
Is that a fair statement? I mean, the way we've built these products, which are always, humic or fulvic strong, that should, if we go in first, so that should be the A in that scenario, the A product, that would allow other products to react less. Is that fair?
We've often thought that is correct. We've never really put it to the test, but from a chemistry standpoint, it makes a lot of sense to do it that way.
Yeah. So what is it within the humic complex that creates that buffering complex? And again, we've talked a lot about humates, and I don't think you can talk enough about humates. I mean, I still will quiz people in our soil academies and talk to them about what is a humic acid, and for the most part, I think it's still a mystery as to what it is. So I wanted to get into the humic complex. And again, you see me calling it humic complex, not an acid, because you've taught us so well that it's chemically not an acid. But for sake of argument, because it's called humic acids, what's the complex within this humic? What's the chemistry within the humic complex that allows the humates to be a buffering agent? What's actually happening there chemically?
They're called amphoteric molecules. Well, we can't even call them molecules. They have an amphoteric characteristic. Let's call it that.
What's that mean?
They contain both positive and negative charges within the same mixture. We can't call them molecules because you can't separate something out.
I can, but you can, because you're a
No, I
chemist.
can't.
Yeah.
Substance.
There you go.
Within those substances, there are both negative and positive charges. So they tend to balance or buffer themselves out in such a manner that if anything comes by them, like any other chemistry gets anywhere near them, they may or may react with them. But in the process, they actually will complex rather than an outright ionic exchange. They're not ionic. And they end up creating chemistry that is really, really hard to understand.
Yeah.
Because when I first started reading it, I was just shaking my head and saying, nah, I don't think so. And then after reading 3, 4, 5 papers that all said the same thing, and I began to accept the chemistry, which is very strange and somewhat predictable. I mean, for example, I was talking about how we can predict whether something will precipitate in the presence of another ion. You throw these humic materials in there and that all changes, totally changes. We can use them to actually prevent precipitation, for example.
Yeah. Which is really the key thing in these witches brews is the precipitation, the chemical reaction that would create a crystal that would clog up a pore or a nozzle. That's the big issue here is, believe me, I can feel for any superintendent with any tank mix that goes through trouble and then has to dump that tank. I mean, the time, the money, the frustration, the aggravation, oftentimes they don't get back to it. I mean, it's a problem. And, and it's, it seems to be getting worse because of these incredible, lengthy tank mixes that we're going through. Is there a certain, let's just stick with fertility I kind of know the answer to this, but I want you to say it. What should we avoid in terms of fertility materials going into a tank in terms of these tank mixes? What are we going to have the biggest problems with when we're putting fertilizers together? What's the biggest combination of reactable fertilizers?
Kind of already covered it. Chlorides, sulfates, phosphates. Those are the big ones.
So, I mean,
I mentioned silicon earlier.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily from the addition of silicon because it's so ubiquitous, you cannot get away from it. It's in every ingredient.
It's the largest element on the face of the earth, right?
Yeah, and it's so hard to get away from it. It's very, very difficult to reduce the silicon content in a formulation. If you're having trouble, and silicon, you like these diagrams that I work with are pointing to silicon. Boy, that's hard. That's really hard to get it down.
But silicon's used a lot in our industry and quite successly. I mean, there's a lot of good silicon products. We had the Silicon Sisters in, Cherie Scarborough and Wendy Zellner, not, a year or so back. And they're doing some really good stuff with silicon. So they're getting it out there and it's reacting and it's working effectively. But like you said, there's so many, and this is part of the frustration that there's so many elements within other products that aren't really why you're putting this in. One of the most obvious, and I was kind of getting to this, is putting in a phosphoric acid with a calcium product. You're going to have a cation anion reaction. I mean, these are problematic reactions that are pretty basic. But, and let me just ask you this question. I put into my tank mix a calcium product and a phosphorus product. What's the result going to be? What am I going to get?
Depends how much iron is present.
I knew you couldn't come up with a straight answer.
Well, iron is another big one. I have to include iron in this because just like silicon, it is, let's just say, impossible to get rid of iron out of these formulations. It's there. You buy copper sulfate, for example. You better have it checked for iron content because it's always there.
Within the copper sulfate product?
Yeah, right.
Now, what's the chemical reaction potential there? What are we looking at?
Iron is extremely reactive element, and it reacts with a lot of things, including zinc, copper. I mean, there's a lot of conflicts right there.
Yeah.
So that's why I like to look at what is manganese. It reacts with manganese.
Yeah.
You have all those four together in a mix, and there's a lot of potential for reaction right there, depending on their balance.
Let's talk about iron. I've said that actually. I was on a soils review an hour ago with a superintendent and looking at his soil tests, and iron in the golf course industry, in the sports turf industry, and turf in general, is one of the biggest selling products because it greens the grass up. But I see iron on a soil test that is 4, 5, or 10x or 100x sometimes what we might have for manganese. And my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong again, is that if I have that much iron in my soil, I'm going to block the potential uptake of copper, manganese, zinc, all the other trace elements. Is that a fair assessment?
That is.
And what's the actual chemistry of that? What is actually happening? What happens in the soil that iron blocks everything else out?
It's very similar to the example I gave earlier about a room full of people, and they all have different.
We're back to the bathroom example. Good.
Well, yeah, and they all have different colors on each color.
Right. What color is iron? Green.
Color, green. Yeah, you could assign a color to all these different micronutrients, and they compete with each other in solution. It's size counts and charge counts. Fe3 is very, very, very reactive material. Fe2 plus, the ferrous version, is a reduced version, not quite as reactive as Fe3. Get them anywhere near aluminum. That's another big one that when it's in solution,
which is prevalent in in most soils. I mean, soils are rich in aluminum,
especially the lower pHs. So you have all these conflicts. Heaven knows why anything works. Once it gets
that's kind of what I'm getting to here, isn't
it? I'm sitting here going, whoa, got to watch this, you got to watch that, you got to watch this. Well, pretty soon you're going to say, oh, I don't believe that guy because he says everything's in conflict.
Too. We all are.
There are a lot of beneficial reactions also, but these interactions have been well studied. And I actually have a whole chart of what interacts with what and what's the result. And I made a presentation of acres with Jerry one time back around 2010 or 2009 on the interactions of trace elements. And
I remember that. I was there.
Oh, you were?
Yes, I was.
Still have that sheet with all the
Yes, I remember that well. I was confused then too, as I am now.
Yeah. And you look at that sheet and it gets very confusing.
Do we have a video of that? I'd love to pull that out and put it here on the podcast. That'd be great. That was a great talk, actually.
Yeah.
And Jerry started really at that point. I mean, that's when you guys started really going down the road of, these trace elements, the mighty micros, and and talking about all that and the interactions of all of them. And that's really where that's probably where I first really realized the effect that iron has on the uptake of other elements in the from the plant, from the soil to the plant. But iron is prevalent in our industry. And, I see, 300 parts per million of iron on a soil test and then 0.005 parts per million of manganese on the paste extract, showing us that we're just not mobilizing it. And it just, from that talk that you guys gave, it was evident to me that iron has a interference with the uptake of some of these other trace elements.
So I've got it up on my screen right now, that same chart.
Oh, go ahead, pull it up. if you
Okay.
can do that. If not, we don't have to worry about it because nobody watches us on video anyway.
Oh,
But what does it say? I mean, just walk us through it because most people are listening.
okay. So what do I click on here? Dashboard.
Just walk your way through it. Don't worry about bringing it up or bring it up.
Can you
There
see
you
it?
go. Oh, okay. This chart, I remember this. So if you're watching us on YouTube, this is actually quite interesting. But go try to talk your way through this so people understand
Yeah.
what they're seeing here.
I'll have to zoom it in.
There you go.
Work? Okay. We were just talking about iron and all the conflicts. There it is right there.
There it is right there. Right.
Yeah. It has to be in balance with boron to be effective.
Yep.
It can actually increase the uptake of cadmium. You don't want that. It antagonizes cobalt, antagonizes chromium. These are all necessary for nitrogen fixation.
Yeah.
Antagonizes copper,
Yep.
antagonizes manganese, antagonizes molybdenum, and antagonizes zinc.
So by saying antagonizes, you're saying it's blocking it, it's preventing it from getting into the plant.
When it's out of balance, when there's far more than there should be, and the balance is it's in its favor, there's more of it than these other things, and then you have all these antagonistic interactions.
So if we have a soil that has high iron, is there a strategy to remove it effectively in the soil profile? I mean, as an agronomist, we're trying to manage our soils.
I remember about 30 years ago, Gary Zimmer came in and hired this guy to sample his soil every 10 feet or some crazy number like that. And this was like a 20-acre site. And over in the corner of when they finally printed out what the concentrations were of all the different elements, in the corner of that site was this way, 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 way over concentration of copper.
Oh.
And so Gary did some digging. What's the history of the site? Well, it used to be a hog pen right there. And they feed them a lot of copper to ward off diseases.
Right.
That copper
Antifungal.
went down in that soil 100 years ago.
And it's still there.
It's there, still there. Whatever you do to a soil, it's still there. You're not going to generate enough uptake with plants. Obviously, that field had been farmed for 100 years, and that copper was still there in over concentration. So what do you do about that, right? Nobody's going to treat a particular corner of their field. You just got to live with
exactly.
it. But if you have an overall situation where, let's say, copper's too high, then you got to look at what antagonizes copper. Iron, great. I think that's already a problem. Manganese, molybdenum, nickel, and we've got selenium. All these things can be added, and zinc. They can be added to try to counterbalance the effect.
The balance goes back to that word balance.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, there's all sorts of reactions. I mean, I think the bottom line here is just be careful, in particular in our industry with iron. Don't overuse iron. It really can affect negatively the uptake. And, and we've talked about traces, and Jerry loved to talk about traces. I think Jerry's favorite term about traces is that they are the spark plugs of the engine. They make everything really happen. They make the enzymatic reactions happen. I mean, what am I missing? I mean, how important are these little critters? And
just enzymes alone, they drive the entire biological system.
And I think the industry is still talking about, we only need like 3 or 4 of them, and there's what 70 or
how come there's 75 elements?
Yeah, and why are they always in the soil? And you're telling me the plant's not going to use them? They're there.
They take them up.
I mean, it's funny because we use a lot of kelp meal, and there's registered 60 trace elements in just kelp meal alone. And so when you're putting these materials out, you're bringing in all sorts of trace elements, which become the backbone of these enzymatic activities that are so essential in the physiology of the plant. And it's there's so much going on. We may not know the whole dynamic of it, but we do know that it's happening. So we're kind of closing our eyes and letting the force be with us and letting all these trace elements. But I still hear in this industry, there's only, you only need 3 or 4 trace elements. Really? I mean, I think you said this on one of the podcasts, they're there, they're in the plant, And you're telling me that the plant's taking these in because they just happen to be piggybacking. I don't remember exactly the terminology of the phrase that you used, but I thought it was pretty brilliant. But it was basically conceptually, if it's in the plant, I mean, you don't think the plant's smart enough to be able to use these things? I mean, how did you word that? Do you remember?
Well, especially now when you can actually investigate the genetic composition of these plants,
Right.
and you find the genes that are necessary to take up these elements that before scientists said, oh, they just take them up by accident. They can't help themselves. Yeah. They're poor little plants.
Oh, what's this guy doing here?
Why do they take up strontium? Well, because it looks a lot like calcium. Oh, okay. Well, then how come you always find strontium in association with calcium in nature?
Yeah.
How come? Well, the plants take up both, and they utilize both for enzymatic activity, by the way. So yeah, they're not taken up by accident. There's that proof is out there. They have genetic and energetic commitment to take up certain elements. And it doesn't matter what's out there. They are still very, very selective on what they take up.
I think Jerry was adamant about this, and you and I have talked about this, but these raw materials that we tend to use, and more companies are using them, and there's very few companies that aren't using something like a kelp meal or maybe a fish meal. I mean, all of these materials, certainly the stuff that we're using in our products at EarthWorks, humic acids, kelp meal, fish meal, molasses, our fermentation, what we call our industrial dairy whey, seawater extracts, which we think have 90 trace elements in the seawater extract, something 70, to that effect,
maybe 70.
Yeah. I mean, there's a product out there.
What you're bringing up here is a pretty good point. All those ingredients you mentioned, I send them out and get them analyzed every once in a while so I can see what the pattern is.
Yeah.
I get them analyzed for 20 elements. Every ingredient that we use in our products, every ingredient goes through a 20 element analysis. Why don't I do 75? Because I don't know what the purpose is for the other 50.
Right. But they're there.
I got 20 of them figured out, sort of, kind of.
Which is more than 6, which is what you see on a soil test.
And they're there. Copper sulfate is a good example, being accompanied by iron, and it's accompanied by zinc. You can't get away with it. I mean, they're all there. You analyze zinc sulfate, and you're going to find a bunch of stuff in there besides zinc, and they're all there, and you can analyze them. So we actually look at what trace elements are accompanying the trace elements that we purposely
what are the friends of the traces,
to make sure we don't overdo something, make sure it's all in balance.
I mean, this is going to sound like a horrible sales pitch, and it's not typically what I do on this podcast, but C3 is a perfect example. I mean, it's our favorite product. It's our biggest selling product, but we measured this. We've got over 70 trace elements in that product. That should be in every tank mix. I mean, that brings to the table all the other elements, just talking elementally, all those elements that will be taken up in the plant, not to mention all the foodstuffs that are going to feed the microbes that will help to move these things into the plant. So, I mean, it's hard to do this sequentially with just elemental raw materials in a tank, because then, first of all, you can't really stabilize that. So if you were to try to get these 70 elements one by one chemically into a tank, it would almost be impossible to do, right?
Yeah, it'd be super expensive too.
Yes, it would be. I didn't even think about that. Yeah. But, having a product that has all of these naturally occurring raw materials that not only are feeding microbes, worm tea extracts, again, the fish and the kelp and the seawater, the organic or the yogurt materials, the fermentation solids, all of these things are bringing each one of them their own little elemental package of trace elements. And again, I don't have this in front of me, but you tested this for us, and it, I think, turned out to be well over 70 elements. That you're right. Like you said, why test more than 20? Because we don't know what they do, but they have to do something. And maybe before you and I are done in this world, maybe we'll know the 20 or 30, or maybe it becomes 40. And hopefully by the time these guys that are in their 20s and 30s now get to our age, they're going to say, oh yeah, there's like 40 that we know about. But
it's a slow process. It's a very slow process.
It's very slow process.
Before we were born, they didn't know copper and zinc had any benefit at all. Let's say go back to the 1920s, or go back to the
Yeah, well, I
19th,
wasn't born in the
20th
20s,
century.
pal. So
Yeah,
let's
before
not
we
go
were
there.
born, long
Yeah.
before us, agronomists didn't even know these elements had any purpose whatsoever.
Yeah.
Now we do know more. We know more about them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we are finding, I mean, there's, and you sit on the AFCO board, or you've been to the AFCO meetings anyway, and you see them talking about this. I mean, it's the slowest wheel that I've ever seen turn in the world. AFCO is the regulatory board that allows us to say that we've got, whatever the element is in our product, and that, they need to prove that it's of value. And every year or so, a new one comes out. Oh, yeah, that works. Oh yeah, okay, you can put that on your label now. It's like, well, why couldn't I have done that?
Their minimum tag guarantees make it almost impossible to create an ecologically sound product, because you have to have a minimum of 500 parts per million, for example, of iron before you can declare it, or manganese. Sometimes that's just way too much. But we can't say it's in there unless we have that minimum guarantee on our label. Well, they're there. Guarantee you they're there, but we cannot put that down on a label unless we hit their so-called minimum guarantees. Instead of a typical analysis, they have to have a regulatory analysis.
Which is probably the most frustrating thing in my life. Is
very frustrating because
working with this whole system of regulatory stuff. So it's kind of crazy. This goes back to this other question, and you and I have talked about here on the podcast, is, a lot of the products that are on the market are very, very linear. And, and when I say linear, I'm talking about selling you fish meal or selling you kelp meal. I mean, right now in the last 2 weeks, I've had multiple conversations. Oh yeah, I've been using molasses, all of which are wonderful. But on a linear basis, and when I mean linear, this is the only thing that is in the jug. It's just molasses or whatever it might be. These things have a limited impact because they're, the biological dynamic is not that great. I mean, I've had for some weird reason, I've had a lot of questions recently about molasses, and molasses.
It's got a high fluorine content.
Yeah, well, yes. So yes, I knew you were going to say that. But
you can only take that so far.
Which is, it's funny you say that, because when Jerry and I first started putting these products together, and the first one we worked on was Kick, and there's a slug of molasses in there, but he was very adamant about, using a very little bit amount of that short chain carbon material, so that we didn't overdose things like chlorine, but we also didn't overdose this heavy available sugar that kept the microbes, keeping them lazy. So, I talk to a lot of folks that are out there pounding molasses on a regular basis, and it's, it's in their tank. I see, a tote of molasses sitting in their shop, and they're putting it in everything in a big slug, and again, when Jerry first started working with this, he really went back and forth, and, the exact amount of molasses to marry with fish and kelp and worm tea and seawater extract and all the other things that are in there. It's the pinnacle of the pyramid. It's a short chain carbon. It's a quick energy. All it is really a quick well, I shouldn't say all, because there is mineral in it, so there's some value to the plant, but it's limited. But it's really designed agronomically, at least in our world, to get that microbial activity up and off to work really quickly.
And you can overdo it.
And you can easily overdo it. And a lot of people, I think. So what happens when you overdo molasses in the soil? What happens to the plant?
Well, fluorine is much nastier than chlorine.
These always something out there.
Yeah, these are halogens that are extremely reactive.
Yeah.
And they will lock onto a lot of things and sequester them, actually. So, you don't want too much fluorine in your soil system, because that's definitely detrimental to the.
And there's a lot in molasses?
Yeah. I forget what it is. I do everything in molar concentration, which needs to be converted to percentages, but it really stood out because I was looking at Jerry's formulations and just asking a simple question. How did he know they were going to work? What made them work?
Yeah,
so I started looking at all the ratios. I started looking at all the ratios of thing. And when you run let's say when you run an analysis, or let's say a database analysis of molasses in our products, it makes sense. He didn't overdo the fluoride. Didn't overdo that at all. And there's other beneficial elements in there.
Yeah, and that's why we've been so adamant about, these products having a a really wide spectrum, or what I call the carbon pyramid, short chain, long chain carbon. So the longer chains being the base of the pyramid, the shorter chains being the pinnacle, and molasses is one of them. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a good description, because so many people are now asking me about, I love molasses, I see a reaction, and it can be a reaction, especially in dead soils, but eventually it's going to accumulate to the point where it's going to be detrimental. And that's really the concern that I have on some of those things. Well, I hate to say this, Mr. Mayhew, but we actually talked longer than I told you we would, and I know you've got things to do. But it's always good to have you here and chatting with us on and confusing us even more than we already were. And I'm grateful to have you as part of our team. And I think this conversation is really poignant. The whole idea of the tank mix is really critical, and it just seems to be getting more of a challenge as more chemistries are coming out. So, do the jar test, do the, bench test anything you're doing, and mark the sequence that you're doing this in, so that you don't create a problem in your tank. And I will still contend, and I think rightfully so, that the EarthWorks liquid products, as humic dense as they are really good starting point. So they should be the A product. Put it in first. Let it buffer the tank, and let it go. I still will contend that, buffering the pH at first is not a bad idea, but getting EarthWorks in there, create that buffer, and help this weird chemistry wheel that spins around all the time. I don't know how you live like this with all this chemistry in your head, but it's it's good. But anyway, Lawrence, thank you so much. I appreciate your time as always, and all your support. And
You're welcome.
Thanks for being here. And if you haven't subscribed to the EarthWorks podcast, please subscribe so you can be told when Mr. Lawrence Mayhew will be back. And we will force him or ask him to come back again in a number of weeks or months, just to keep this conversation going. Like I said, without building your head, you are clearly one of the most listened to EarthWorks podcasts. And so for that, I'm grateful as well. So, Mr. Mayhew, thank you so much.